Our women and our youth have stepped forward to defend the homeland from any kind of aggression. Don't you see how the journalists, or Karina's hired mouthpieces, terrified their own people? Look at it ever since August 8th. That's been the case. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. They don't even have a nail left on their fingers. And still, they don't show up. Where are they? We don't take any of this as a game. We never treat threats from imperialism as a joke. In the Venezuelan regime, tensions are rising. Daudo Cabello, the Minister of Interior, Justice, and PC's Minister of Peace asks, "What's going on? Why the Americans aren't arriving?" It sounds like he says it mockingly, in a joking tone. But here's the thing. He has a problem. He doesn't know what the hell is happening. And more importantly, he doesn't know what the hell might happen. Because one way or another, the US deployment is already having consequences. For example, Secretary of State Marco Rubio just announced that he will travel to Mexico and Ecuador in the coming days. Rubio will travel again to Latin America, while Trump prioritizes immigration. The agenda is to secure more support in the fight against illegal immigration and stronger commitments in the war against the major drug cartels. And in a way, this may also be connected to the future of Maduro and his inner circle. Why? Because Mexico and Ecuador are two of the countries that could be hit hardest if the US decides to shut down drug routes through the Caribbean. And especially if Washington ends up carrying out some kind of operation in Venezuela. If that happens, traffickers would have to look for alternatives. They would need alternatives to Caribbean waters and alternatives to Venezuela itself. Applause, and that's where these two countries come in, because in this business, it's practically impossible to completely stop drug trafficking. Shut down one route, and soon new leaks and alternatives appear elsewhere. And in this case, as I said, the alternatives could be precisely Mexico and Ecuador to countries that have been having serious problems with drug trafficking lately. Ecuador has become a highway for cocaine heading toward the United States and Europe. For example, Ecuador is already the third country in the world in drug seizures, after Colombia and the United States. In 2024 alone, they seized no less than 300 tons, a historic record that shows the drug presence in that country is only getting worse. And now, with US destroyers in the Caribbean, off Venezuela's coast, and very close to Colombian routes, many fear traffickers will quickly move operations to safer areas. In fact, Trump wouldn't even have to fire a single missile at Venezuela. Just having US ships cruising these waters is enough to force traffickers to find new routes. But why are we talking specifically about these two countries? Well, let's break it down. Mexico, as you know, plays an absolutely crucial role because it's a huge producer. It has extremely powerful cartels, a massive 1,900-mile border with the United States, and a gigantic volume of trade with Uncle Sam. All of this makes it much easier to get narcotics across and closely control their distribution. It's the preferred gateway, and if the Caribbean route is blocked, shipments from Mexico could spike again. Ecuador, for its part, is also key because it shares a northern border with Colombia that overlaps with the continent's main coca-producing regions. To the south, it borders Peru, another major coca producer. On top of that, it has a prime coastline on the Pacific Ocean, which traffickers use to ship drugs worldwide, often hidden in banana or cacao shipments, two of Ecuador's top exports. They also send product through the Mexican route using speedboats, semi-submersibles, and fishing vessels. It's estimated that more than a third of Colombian cocaine is now distributed from Ecuador. The country has become an increasingly important logistical hub, with all the consequences that entails. Think about it. Ecuador now has the highest murder rate in Latin America, one killing every hour. And with the US naval operation in the Caribbean, things could get even worse. Of course, Mexico and Ecuador are not the only ones on edge about the US buildup in the Caribbean, and a possible action against Chavismo and the so-called Cartel of the Suns. Not at all. Take this. The Chavista dictatorship is doubling down on pressure over the Essequibo. They've called on citizens to enlist to defend Venezuela. In the middle of the territorial dispute with Guyana and the growing tensions with the US, Niels Willemyser urged the population to take part in recruitment drives and show national unity. Yes, Guyana and the Essequibo are also watching closely to see what happens in Venezuela, partly because the Bolivarian regime may be considering using this card to pressure the United States. Just days before Trump's naval deployment, Maduro once again threatened Guyana and even U.S. oil companies. The miracle of fully recovering the Essequibo, we'll see that sooner rather than later. Whatever maneuver ExxonMobil or imperialism tries in the international court or wherever they want to play their games, let them kick, let them waste their money. At the end of the day, the Geneva Agreement and Venezuela's rights to our Essequibo will prevail. The Essequibo is ours. Pressuring Washington with Guyana would be pure madness. But who knows what goes through the minds of these guys? I'm not going to trust in the good judgment of such guerrillas. But here's the question. What role does Guyana country with just over 800,000 people, that many couldn't even place on a map, have in the standoff between Trump and Maduro? Well, friends, the answer is much crazier and much more important than it may seem at first glance. And yes, the key is oil. Still, let us not forget that Venezuela also has another resource that is very much in demand these days: gold, real gold. A commodity at record highs that has outperformed even Wall Street. While the S&P 500 averaged about 6% annual returns, gold has exceeded 8% per year. And that's no accident. Gold is limited, it's hard to produce, and its supply doesn't depend on political decisions. That's why in times of tension, its price skyrockets. Gold acts as a shield, a store of value, a safe haven asset. Now, let's return to Maduro's card. First, for those less familiar with the region, what exactly is the Essequibo? Basically, it's the territory west of the Essequibo River, between Venezuela and Guyana. At first glance, it looks like just another patch of Amazon jungle rivers, mosquitoes, and not much else. But this place is also the site of one of the oldest territorial disputes in Latin America. When Venezuela became independent from Spain, it claimed the border with Dutch colonies, later British colonies, was marked by the Essequibo River. In other words, everything west of it belonged to Venezuela. That would mean 2/3 of present-day Guyana, exactly the claim Caracas still maintains. And you might ask, isn't Venezuela already big enough to not be claiming another chunk of jungle? Sure, Venezuela is huge. But the Essequibo hides an enormous treasure not just on land, but especially offshore, in the exclusive economic zone linked to this territory. What lies beneath those waters? Many of you already know, some of the most promising oil deposits in Latin America. Who's benefiting the most from Guyana's oil? That's right, the Americans. Which brings us back to the growing conflict between the US and Venezuela. Caracas accuses Guyana of being nothing more than a pawn of ExxonMobil. What was once a historic dispute between Venezuela and Guyana has now turned into a tug-of-war with Washington, involving Exxon, Chevron, the International Court of Justice, U.S. naval ships in the Caribbean, and Maduro shouting, "The Essequibo is ours," as ESSA ships blockade the Caribbean. Anxiety is mounting in Georgetown. Guyana warned that the dispute with Venezuela could destabilize the region. Its government called for stronger cooperation against transnational organized crime and narcoterrorism, a direct reference to the Cartel of the Suns, which the U.S. links to Maduro. But why is Chavismo escalating this issue now? In 2015, ExxonMobil discovered oil in Guyana, over 11 billion barrels of crude and counting. The company immediately poured in massive investments to develop the fields. As a result, Guyana became the fastest-growing economy in the world. It now produces almost 1 million barrels a day, about the same as all of Venezuela. By 2030, it could reach 1.7 million. In 2024 alone, Guyana's GDP soared 34%, and it's been growing like that for several years. With so much oil and so few people, Guyana has gone from obscurity to becoming the new Cuba of the Caribbean, this time with strong U.S. backing. So now, as Trump threatens Maduro with warships and the Bolivarian regime knows it can't beat Uncle Sam, it seems they've decided to play this pressure card. But by threatening U.S. oil interests, they might just tilt the balance toward military action. Marco Rubio has already warned Venezuela that the U.S. will use force if it attacks oil-rich Guyana. Another reason for this move may be that the Essequibo dispute is one of the few issues where the regime and Venezuelan people are united. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum asking Venezuelans if they wanted the Essequibo to become part of Venezuela. Predictably, over 95% voted yes. Of course, with Chavista elections, reliability is questionable, but beyond the ballot box, the sentiment is real. To capitalize on it, Maduro created a new Guyana Essequibo state, appointed a military governor, and began issuing exploitation licenses in a territory that legally isn't his. Georgetown took the case to the International Court of Justice, which in May 2024 ordered Caracas to halt any moves in the area until the case is resolved. Naturally, Maduro ignored it, choosing nationalism around the Essequibo as a tool of internal legitimacy. Now, with the U.S. fleet at his doorstep, Maduro casts himself as the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty and accuses Georgetown of being Washington's puppet. His goal is twofold. First, shouting the Essequibo is ours plays well in Caracas, even if people's fridges are empty. And second, it's a message to Washington. Negotiate, or we'll turn this conflict into a fire that could threaten even ExxonMobil's infrastructure. But that would be like shooting himself in the foot. Nobody in their right mind takes the threat seriously. If anything, escalating could backfire on Chavismo itself. Meanwhile, how are things looking in the Caribbean waters? The U.S. continues its buildup. The rapid response amphibious group Iwo Jima set sail from Norfolk, Virginia, after dodging a hurricane, and is now in the Caribbean near Curacao. The group includes the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, the transport dock USS San Antonio, and the landing ship USS Fort Lauderdale together, carrying 4,500 personnel, including the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, with 2,200 Marines ready for action. And that's not all. According to Reuters, early next week, more assets will join. The guided missile cruiser USS Lake Erie and the nuclear-powered submarine USS Newport News. In other words, the buildup keeps growing: destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and aerial support with P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft. What's the goal? Analysts warn. Keep a cool head. The operation may be aimed at striking major drug routes as a show of force by Trump or, at most, hitting some Venezuelan infrastructure, but not necessarily taking down the regime itself. Nothing is decided yet. And what about Caracas? Besides threatening Guyana and cranking up propaganda, Maduro sent a letter to the UN Secretary General expressing Venezuela's deepest concern over U.S. aggression. At the same time, they suddenly announced this drug trafficking logistics hub destroyed in Venezuelan border state with Colombia. Could this be a message to Washington that they're willing to cooperate? That's exactly how it looks. Will it work? How do you think this story will end? Will the U.S. intervene? Will Chavismo oust Maduro itself? Or will nothing happen in the end? Nobody has a crystal ball, but we all have an idea of what could unfold in the coming weeks and months.